The airport was a symphony of movement and voices, a place where time seemed both rushed and frozen in pockets of anticipation. Flight announcements echoed overhead, blending with the low murmur of conversations, the clatter of suitcases rolling across polished floors, and the occasional sharp reprimand of an impatient traveler. Amid the chaos, Lyra Colton stood at the first-class boarding gate, her posture relaxed but her mind keenly aware of her surroundings. She was used to moving through spaces where her presence was questioned, where her existence in luxury was met with silent, or sometimes not so silent, doubt. She wasn't just any black girl waiting to board a plane. She was a Colton, heiress to a billion-dollar empire, one of the wealthiest families in the world. But unlike the media's portrayal of heiresses draped in designer labels and followed by an entourage, Lyra dressed modestly, preferring a casual elegance that didn't immediately scream money. Today, she wore a simple yet crisp navy blazer, a white blouse, tailored slacks, and designer sneakers that only those with a sharp eye for luxury would recognize. For Lyra, wealth wasn't something to flaunt. It was something to wield with purpose and power, but only when necessary. And at that moment, she wanted nothing more than to board her flight in peace. But peace, as she had learned time and time again, was a luxury rarely afforded to black girls in spaces that people like Karen Lancaster believed they didn't belong. Across the gate, Karen Lancaster stood with an air of quiet superiority, watching the line with hawk-like precision. Unlike the other flight attendants who smiled and exchanged polite small talk with passengers, Karen's expression remained pinched and analytical, as though she was personally evaluating who was worthy of boarding her flight. Karen had worked in first class for over a decade, a veteran of the skies who prided herself on maintaining order among the wealthy elite. She had seen it all: business moguls, celebrities, politicians, even royalty. They all had a certain air about them, a certain presence that made it clear they belonged in first class. And then there were people like her. Karen's eyes landed on Lyra, and an almost imperceptible sneer curled at the edge of her mouth. A young black girl, standing in the priority boarding lane, alone. It wasn't just the color of her skin that irked Karen. It was the confidence in her stance, the ease with which she carried herself. She wasn't starstruck or timid, like some of the influencers Karen had seen trying to sneak their way into luxury. She stood tall, assured, as though she truly believed she had a place there. Karen's lips pressed together in irritation. She had seen this before. Black passengers trying to upgrade themselves with fake tickets, fraudulent boarding passes, or flimsy excuses. It was always the same excuse, always the same story. And Karen had made it her personal mission to keep first class exclusive. Lyra's turn arrived. She stepped forward, her polished boarding pass in hand, and offered a polite smile. "Good evening," she said smoothly, handing over her ticket. Karen barely looked at her, eyes zeroing in on the ticket instead. She took it between her fingers, but something about the situation didn't sit right with her. The name printed on the pass, Lyra Colton, tickled at something familiar in the back of her mind. Karen's lips pursed. She had seen the name before, but she couldn't place it. Instead of processing the ticket as she had done for every other first-class passenger before, she tilted her head slightly, her expression dripping with suspicion. "Are you sure this is yours?" Karen asked, her tone flat and unimpressed. Lyra blinked, momentarily thrown by the question. "Yes, why wouldn't it be?" Karen exhaled sharply through her nose, as if she had been presented with the world's most exhausting problem. "You don't look like you belong in first class," she said, her voice just loud enough for the surrounding passengers to hear. A few nearby heads turned. A sharp prickle of awareness crawled up Lyra's spine. There it was, the moment she had been expecting. She could have shut it down immediately, flashing her credentials, dropping her last name like an iron gavel, demanding to speak to a manager like people like Karen usually did when the roles were reversed. But Lyra had spent her life moving through spaces like this. Spaces where power wasn't just about money, but about knowing when to wield it. She tilted her head slightly, studying Karen just as intensely as Karen had studied her. "I don't look like I belong?" she repeated slowly. Karen shrugged, mock innocence dripping from her expression. "I just mean, We get a lot of mix-ups. You'd be surprised how many people think they're in first class when they're really in economy. Lyra's fingers tightened around the handle of her carry-on, but before she could respond, Karen did something that turned the already tense situation into something far uglier. She took Lyra's boarding pass and ripped it in half. The sound of tearing paper sliced through the murmurs of the waiting area, leaving behind a moment of complete stunned silence. Passengers gasped. A nearby businessman stepped back, looking between Lyra and Karen in shock. Lyra's breath hitched, her mind struggling to process what had just happened. Karen, however, remained unbothered, her smirk deepening. She tossed the shredded ticket into the trash like it was worthless scrap paper and crossed her arms. "Find another flight," she said, voice cold. "Or better yet, pay for one you can actually afford." Lyra stared at her, momentarily speechless. Not because she was afraid, not because she was embarrassed, but because Karen had just made the worst mistake of her career. She just didn't know it yet. And Lyra Colton? She had no intention of letting this slide. For a moment, everything was still. The paper scraps of Lyra's first-class ticket fluttered to the floor, caught in the artificial breeze of the airport's ventilation system. The silence was suffocating, heavy with the weight of what had just happened. Lyra felt the eyes of dozens of passengers boring into her, some shocked, some scandalized, and some indifferent, as if this wasn't their problem. Karen tilted her chin higher, arms crossed, the satisfaction barely concealed in her smirk. Lyra's heart pounded like a war drum, but her face remained impassive, her expression carefully neutral. She had spent years perfecting this reaction, this ability to stand in the face of insult and injustice and appear utterly, breathtakingly unbothered. Inside, however, the fire raged. The whispers started. "Did she just... She ripped up her ticket? That's not legal, right?" An older woman in line stepped forward, her face twisted in outrage. "You can't just destroy someone's ticket like that. That's their property." Karen, unfazed, shot the woman a glare. "Stay out of this, ma'am." Then she turned back to Lyra, her expression dripping with feigned pity. "I'll say it again. You're not boarding this flight." Lyra's fingers tightened around her suitcase handle, knuckles white with restraint. She could end this right now. She could drop her last name, make a call, and watch Karen's entire career go up in flames in under 15 minutes. But no, that was too easy. Karen wasn't just some rogue employee. She was a symptom of a larger disease. A disease of unchecked bias, arrogance, and an illusion of superiority that people like her wore like armor. No, Lyra wasn't just going to destroy Karen's career. She was going to dismantle the entire system that allowed her to exist. Karen was still talking, her words slow and deliberate, as if she was speaking to a child. "You can either go back to the main desk and purchase an actual ticket." Lyra moved. Not toward the ticket counter, toward Karen. Karen's smirk faltered. Lyra stepped in closer, just enough that only Karen could hear what she said next. Her voice was quiet, controlled, like a blade slipping between ribs. "You just made the worst mistake of your life." Karen snorted, though there was a flicker of unease in her eyes. "Is that so?" she sneered, trying to regain her footing. "What are you going to do, complain?" Lyra let the silence stretch, let Karen squirm for a second. Then she pulled out her phone, her thumb moving fast, sending a single text. The moment she hit send, she looked up and smiled. "Oh, I'm not going to complain," she murmured. "I'm going to watch." Karen blinked. "What?" And then things started to shift. The arrival of power. Karen didn't notice it at first. The subtle shift in the atmosphere. The way the airport staff suddenly began whispering to one another. The way a security officer who had been standing idly nearby straightened his posture and spoke into his radio, eyes darting to Lyra and then away, like he was afraid to make eye contact. Karen was still too caught up in her delusion of control to recognize the storm she had just invited into her life. Then came the first real warning sign. The boarding gate phone rang. One of Karen's colleagues, a young, nervous flight attendant named James, picked it up. His face drained of color almost instantly. He looked up, locking eyes with Karen, his expression stricken. Karen frowned. "What is it?" James opened his mouth, then stopped. Slowly, he turned the receiver around. "It's for you." Karen scoffed, annoyed, and snatched the phone from his hands. "This is Karen, senior flight attendant. How can I—" She never finished the sentence. Because the moment she heard the voice on the other end, the smirk on her face shattered like glass. Her fingers tightened around the phone, knuckles suddenly bloodless. I don't understand," she stammered. Her colleagues walked. Karen flinched as the voice on the line cut her off sharply. Lyra simply stood there, watching, waiting. Because she already knew exactly what was happening. The name that changed everything. Karen was still trying to salvage the situation, still trying to speak, but whatever was being said on the other end was making her panic. James, the young flight attendant, had a realization flash across his face. His eyes darted from Karen to Lyra, and then finally to Lyra's last name printed on the torn ticket still resting in the trash bin. And that's when he put it together. His entire body went rigid with shock. "Colton," he whispered under his breath. Karen was still stammering into the phone, but James barely heard her. His gaze snapped to Lyra, horror dawning on him like a slow-moving train wreck. Karen must have sensed the change in the air because she finally hung up the phone, her movements shaky and abrupt. She turned back to Lyra, something dangerously close to fear creeping into her previously smug expression. "Who are you?" Lyra tilted her head, a mockingly sweet smile curving her lips. "Oh," she said, her voice light and casual, like they were just exchanging pleasantries. "Didn't I mention?" Karen swallowed hard. "I'm Lyra Colton." And then she let the weight of that name crash down upon Karen like an avalanche. The realization of doom. The name hit Karen like a gunshot to the chest. Colton. Not just any Colton. Nathaniel Colton's daughter. The billionaire CEO of one of the most powerful companies in the world. A man whose business empire stretched across industries, technology, real estate, global trade, and most importantly, the airline she worked for. Karen's face lost all color. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. Lyra, finally satisfied that Karen understood the depth of her mistake, stepped forward and leaned in just enough to whisper one final thing. "Your shift is over, Karen." And then she smiled. Because she knew. Karen wasn't just about to lose her job. She was about to lose everything. Karen's breath came shallow and uneven. The weight of the name Colton settled over her like a suffocating fog, pressing against her chest, making it hard to think, hard to breathe. She glanced around, searching for an escape, but there was none. The passengers, once passive spectators, now watched with newfound intrigue. Some whispered among themselves, the realization spreading like wildfire. Karen's world was collapsing, and she could feel it. The power she had wielded so effortlessly just moments ago, the ability to humiliate, dismiss, and control, was now slipping through her fingers like grains of sand. And the worst part? She knew it was only the beginning, the arrival of the storm. It started with the sharp click of polished shoes against the terminal floor, the kind of sound that commanded attention without demanding it, the kind of sound that announced authority before words ever had to be spoken. Karen snapped her head toward the source, her pulse thundering in her ears. There, moving through the terminal with quiet, lethal precision, was Nathaniel Colton, and he was not alone. Beside him, two high-ranking airline executives struggled to match his pace, their faces drawn tight with stress. Behind them, several black-suited security personnel flanked either side, their expressions stone-cold and unreadable. Passengers parted like the Red Sea, sensing that something far bigger than an average customer complaint was unfolding before them. Karen's stomach twisted painfully. She had expected maybe a manager, a supervisor at most, someone she could charm or manipulate. Not this, not him. She could practically feel the walls closing in around her. Lyra's poised revenge. Karen turned to Lyra, who stood completely still, her arms crossed, her face as calm as a queen, watching an execution she had orchestrated. And then, just to twist the knife deeper, Lyra smirked. It was a small expression, a subtle shift in the corners of her lips. But it was devastating. Because for the first time since this entire nightmare began, Karen understood something terrifying. Lyra had planned for this. She had never been helpless. She had never been beneath her. Karen had played herself. The reckoning. Nathaniel didn't slow down until he reached the gate counter, his towering presence casting a long, dark shadow over Karen's trembling form. He didn't look at her at first. Instead, his sharp, piercing eyes landed on Lyra, and just like that, the coldness in them softened. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice measured, controlled, but laced with something lethal underneath. Lyra, ever composed, simply nodded. "I'm fine, Dad," she said smoothly. "Just a bit of inconvenience." Nathaniel exhaled slowly as if he were holding back the urge to unleash hell right then and there. Then, finally, he turned to Karen. And everything changed. The fall of Karen Lancaster. If looks could kill, Karen would have turned to dust. Nathaniel's stare pinned her to the spot, stripping her of every ounce of authority she thought she had. He didn't speak immediately. He let the silence stretch. Let her squirm. Let the weight of her actions press into her like a crushing force. And then his voice came, low and deadly. "You tore up my daughter's. Ticket Karen's entire body locked up." "Sir, She tried to force out a response, but Nathaniel tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. And that small, almost imperceptible movement shut her up instantly. Because Karen was looking at a man who didn't need to raise his voice to be terrifying. A man who could destroy her with nothing but a single command. Behind him, the airline executives looked anywhere but at Karen, their silence a death sentence in itself. She was alone in this fight, and she was losing. The corporate bloodbath begins. Nathaniel turned to one of the executives, a wiry man with graying hair and a name tag that read Elliot, the regional director of the airline. "Explain," Nathaniel commanded. Elliot stiffened, swallowing thickly. "Well, sir, there was a misunderstanding," Elliot stammered. Nathaniel's gaze hardened. "A misunderstanding?" His voice was silk-covered steel. He gestured to the scattered remnants of Lyra's boarding pass on the floor. "Did the ticket misunderstand itself into 2 pieces?" The color drained from Elliot's face. Karen felt faint. She tried again. "Sir, I genuinely thought—" "You thought?" Nathaniel cut her off so sharply it felt like a whip crack. "Did you think before you decided to humiliate a first-class passenger? Did you think before you assumed that a young black woman couldn't possibly belong in this space? Did you think before you tried to flex your authority in a situation where you had none?" Karen felt her stomach twist painfully. She was drowning, and there was no one to pull her out. Lyra watched silently, her expression unreadable but her eyes sharp with triumph. Karen grasped for straws, her voice breaking. Please, Mr. Colton," she stammered. I was just doing my job." Nathaniel's expression darkened. "If this is how you do your job, then you shouldn't have one." And just like that, the final verdict was made. Karen collapsed into silence, the full gravity of her actions crushing down on her like an avalanche. The final blow. Nathaniel turned back to Elliot. "I expect you to handle this," he said flatly. Elliot nodded so fast it was almost pathetic. "Absolutely, sir. Immediate termination, and—" He gulped. "We will personally issue a formal apology to Miss Colton." Nathaniel didn't even acknowledge the apology. His job was done here. Without another glance at Karen, he placed a gentle hand on Lyra's back, guiding her away. The message was clear. She wasn't worth another second of their time. Karen watched them go, her vision swimming, her body numb. She had lost everything. Karen stood frozen, her pulse a frantic drumbeat in her ears as she watched Nathaniel Colton walk away with his daughter. It was over. Her world, the one where she ruled the first-class gate with smug authority, where her decisions were unquestionable, where she was the gatekeeper of exclusivity, was now a crumbling empire of dust. But the worst was yet to come, because now everyone was watching. The fall begins. The whisper swelled into something louder. Passengers, employees, even her fellow flight attendants were no longer quietly observing. They were talking. The scandal spread through the terminal like wildfire, jumping from person to person, feeding on shock, outrage, and schadenfreude. Karen could feel their stares, some filled with satisfaction, others with disgust. A businessman near the front of the line shook his head, muttering, "She really thought she was untouchable." A young woman in a stylish blazer pulled out her phone, already typing. Karen's stomach lurched. Number not this, not the internet. The first blow, the viral storm. Before Karen could process her next move, a sharp voice cut through the noise. It was James, the young flight attendant who had handed her the phone earlier. Only now he wasn't nervous anymore. Now he looked furious. "You just humiliated the daughter of the airline's biggest investor," James said, his voice dripping with disbelief. Karen turned on him, desperate. I didn't know. No one told me who she was." James let out a humorless laugh. "That's the point, Karen. You didn't care. You saw a young black woman and assumed she didn't belong." Karen's mouth opened, but no words came out. Because what could she say? She hadn't just assumed, she had acted on that assumption with arrogance and cruelty, and now the world was watching. The death sentence, the manager's arrival. The crowd suddenly shifted as another figure stepped through. Elliot, the airline's regional director, returned. Only this time he wasn't alone. Trailing behind him were two men in dark suits, corporate enforcers, the kind of executives who didn't deal with minor infractions but catastrophic failures. Failures like Karen Lancaster. Karen felt her legs weaken. She knew these men. They weren't here to discipline her. They were here to bury her. The official termination, Karen Lancaster. Elliot's voice was mechanical, void of emotion. Karen's breath hitched. "Effective immediately," Elliot continued. "You are terminated from your position with this airline." The words felt like a physical strike, knocking the air from her lungs. She looked around wildly, searching for someone, anyone, to come to her defense. But there was no one. Her colleagues averted their eyes. Her supervisors stood silent. Even the passengers, people she had once dismissed as beneath her concern, watched with quiet satisfaction. Her kingdom had crumbled. The final humiliation, the walk of shame. The two corporate enforcers stepped forward, one holding a clipboard with final termination papers, the other reaching for her airline badge. Karen's fingers trembled as she unpinned the badge from her uniform. She had worn it for years. It had been a symbol of authority, a weapon she wielded mercilessly. And now it was being stripped from her like a condemned knight losing her sword. When she placed the badge into the enforcer's palm, something inside her cracked. Then the walk of shame began. Security escorted her through the terminal, flanked by the murmuring crowd, the passengers she had just mocked, the employees who had suffered under her reign. With every step, the reality sank deeper. She wasn't just losing a job, she was losing everything. The internet strikes back. By the time she reached the airport's exit, her name was already trending. Someone had recorded the entire incident. The video had gone viral in under 20 minutes. Racist flight attendant humiliates black billionaire heiress gets fired on the spot. Karen in the skies just got grounded for life. Colton Airlines CEO's daughter exposes discrimination at first-class gate. Watch the shocking footage. Karen stared in horror at the screen of a nearby passenger's phone as the video played. There she was, smug, condescending, tearing up the ticket with utter disdain. Then, the shift in her expression when she realized who Lyra was. The downfall, broadcasted for millions. Karen staggered back, the weight of her own actions closing in on her like an unrelenting vice. She had thought she was invincible. Now she was nothing but a cautionary tale. Lyra's last words. Meanwhile, back inside the terminal, Lyra watched the scene unfold through the large glass windows. Her father stood beside her, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. "She'll never work in this industry again," Nathaniel murmured. Lyra exhaled softly, watching as Karen disappeared into the crowd, a ghost of the arrogance she once wore so proudly. Then, Lyra smiled. But it wasn't a smile of malice, it was a smile of understanding. Because Karen had done this to herself, and the world had merely... Karen stumbled into the airport parking lot, her mind racing, her body still numb from the catastrophic fall she had just experienced. Her hands trembled as she pulled her phone from her pocket, her breath coming in sharp, ragged gasps. She needed to call someone, anyone who could help. Someone who could undo this. Her fingers hovered over the screen, but the moment she unlocked her phone, her heart stopped, because her name was already on every news outlet in the country. The headlines of a scandal. Every notification on her phone was an explosion of disaster. The first article hit like a gunshot to the chest. First-class Karen, flight attendant fired after publicly humiliating black billionaire heiress. Another one followed. Racist airline employee learns the hard way who she was messing with. And then, the worst one. Colton Airlines cuts ties with disgraced flight attendant Karen Lancaster. CEO's daughter takes action. Her throat went dry. The video was everywhere. She clicked on a link to a live broadcast and her own face filled the screen, captured mid-smirk just before she had torn Lyra's ticket in half. The camera caught everything, the sneer, the arrogance, the patronizing dismissal. It replayed in agonizing slow motion before cutting to the moment her smug confidence shattered the second she heard Lyra's last name. Karen's entire body burned with shame. The backlash begins. Her social media accounts were under siege. "You deserved this. You're disgusting. I hope you never work again." Imagine thinking you had power over a Colton. Clown behavior. Your career is in the trash where it belongs. Even her email was flooded, with everything from angry letters to death threats. Her name was trending globally, not as a respected flight attendant, but as a symbol of racial arrogance and entitlement. Her chest heaved, her fingers tightening around her phone until they hurt. She tried to call her manager, her union rep, even an old friend in HR. No one answered. She was completely alone. The calls that never came desperate, she dialed her best friend Dana. Dana answered after the fourth ring, her voice tense. "Karen," she said, immediately on edge. Karen exhaled in relief, gripping onto the last thread of hope she had. "Dana, please, you have to help me. Everything's falling apart. I need to..." But Dana cut her off sharply. "Help you?" Her voice was tight with disbelief. "Karen, what the hell were you thinking?" Karen froze. "Excuse me?" she breathed. Dana scoffed. "I just watched the video. I can't believe you actually did that." Karen's stomach twisted painfully. "But you know me," she pleaded, her voice cracking. "You know I'm not like that. This whole thing is being blown out of proportion." Dana went silent for a long, damning moment. Then finally, her voice came back cold. "I think this is exactly who you are." And then she hung up. Karen stared at the screen, the empty call line ringing louder than any insult ever could. Her own best friend had abandoned her. A life in ruins. She had no job, no reputation, no allies left. Even her landlord sent her an email. Given recent events, we believe it is in the best interest of the property's image that you vacate within 30 days. She had become poison, and there was no escape. Meanwhile, the rise of Lyra Colton. Across the city, Lyra sat in a private boardroom, scrolling through the same headlines with a calculated expression. Her father sat across from her, arms crossed. "Well," he said, watching her carefully, "the damage is done." Lyra exhaled softly, placing her phone on the sleek glass table. "Not yet," she murmured. Nathaniel raised an eyebrow. Lyra's gaze sharpened. "It's not enough for Karen Lancaster to lose her job," she said smoothly. "We need to ensure that what happened at that gate never happens again." Nathaniel leaned back. "Go on." Lyra's mind was already moving at lightning speed, her voice steady. "I want a full investigation into past discrimination complaints against airline staff," she said. "If Karen got away with this, how many others have done the same?" Nathaniel nodded slowly. "And then?" Lyra's lips curved into a small, knowing smile. "We make an example of her," she said. Nathaniel's brows lifted slightly. "She's already been fired," he pointed out. Lyra tilted her head. "Fired as a consequence," she said. "I want a legacy." The Colton Initiative 1 week later, a press release shook the aviation industry to its core. The Colton family was launching a multi-million-dollar initiative, not just to improve bias training in their airline, but to create an independent watchdog organization that would oversee discrimination complaints in the airline industry as a whole. The name? The Colton Initiative for Fair Travel. A statement from Lyra Colton accompanied the release. "No one should ever experience what I did. We are taking steps to ensure the airline industry moves forward, not backward." It was plastered on news networks, websites, and social media, praised as a historic moment for equality in corporate travel. And Karen Lancaster's name? It was forever tied to it. She was not just a disgraced employee. She was now a case study in racial bias, the living embodiment of what happens when prejudice meets power and loses. The final blow. Karen sat alone in her tiny apartment, her life in shambles. She had spent days trying to find another job, any job, but every application ended the same way. "We regret to inform you." No one wanted to hire the most infamous flight attendant in the country. No one wanted to be associated with her. She had become a ghost, a warning, a pariah. Her phone vibrated. She snatched it up desperately. But the moment she saw the sender, her blood turned to ice. It was from a blocked number. A single message. "The Colton Initiative starts next week. Your legacy lives on." Karen stared at the screen, her hands trembling violently. She didn't need a signature. She already knew who sent it. Lyra. And in that moment, she understood the full weight of her mistake. Karen had tried to tear a young black woman down, and instead she had built her an empire. Karen sat in the dim silence of her tiny apartment, the glow of her laptop screen casting eerie shadows on her gaunt face. She hadn't slept in days. The headlines never stopped. Everywhere she looked, her downfall was dissected, analyzed, replayed over and over again. The Colton Initiative was launching tomorrow, and her name was written all over it. Not as a hero, not as an ally, but as a warning. She wasn't just unemployed, she was erased from the industry. Every airline had blacklisted her. Every job application had been denied before it was even considered. Even hotels refused to rent rooms to her, fearing the bad press that came with her name. She had gone from a feared senior flight attendant to a cautionary tale whispered about in hushed tones. And worst of all, Lyra Colton was untouchable. Karen had tried to crush her. Instead, she had made her a legend, and now she wanted revenge. Lyra's ascent. Across the city, Lyra Colton stood in the center of a grand ballroom, her presence commanding the attention of hundreds of powerful figures. The Colton Initiative's official launch event was a spectacle of wealth, prestige, and progress. News cameras flashed, corporate leaders shook hands with her. Civil rights activists praised her work. Even her father, Nathaniel Colton, looked at her with genuine admiration. She had not just won, she had rewritten the rules. From the ashes of one woman's downfall, Lyra had built something indestructible. As she took the stage, a hush fell over the room. And then she spoke. One act of cruelty exposed a system of bias. Her voice was calm but razor sharp. We are here today because one flight attendant thought she could decide who belonged and who didn't. A murmur ran through the audience. Everyone knew who she was talking about. She believed her power was absolute. She believed she could dismiss me, erase me, humiliate me. Lyra let the silence stretch, then smiled faintly. She was wrong. Applause thundered through the room. But this isn't just about me. This is about every passenger who has ever been treated as less than. This is about the people who never had the chance to call their father to fix it. Lyra's expression hardened. That changes today. Karen's breaking point. Karen watched the speech from her laptop, her nails digging into her palms. Lyra had made a career out of her downfall. Her name had become legendary. And Karen? Karen was rotting in obscurity. No one would hire her. No one would return her calls. Even her own family had distanced themselves. She was radioactive. She had lost her job, her reputation, her home. She had nothing left to lose. Except one thing. Lyra Colton, a desperate plan. Karen stared at the screen, her heart hammering. If she couldn't get her life back, then she'd take Lyra's, the stalker in the shadows. Lyra had never felt more powerful. As she exited the gala, the night buzzed with electricity. The world was watching her now, but she didn't notice the pair of eyes watching her from the darkness. Karen stood in the shadows, her hair a mess, her clothes wrinkled, a ghost of the woman she used to be. She had spent the last week tracking Lyra's movements, her meetings, her speeches, her routines. And now, as Lyra slipped into her black SUV, Karen made her move. She slid into a nearby car, gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. If Lyra had taken everything from her, then Karen would take it all back by force. The chase. The SUV pulled out onto the dark city streets, and Karen followed. Her mind was a cyclone of rage and desperation. She could fix this. She could make Lyra Colton suffer the way she had suffered. Ahead, the SUV turned down a quiet, winding road. Karen's foot pressed harder on the gas. Faster. Faster. She would make her pay, but she never saw the black sedan creeping up behind her. The trap. Karen barely had time to react before the sedan cut her off, forcing her car to screech to a stop. The doors flung open, and 3 security agents rushed toward her, guns drawn. Karen's breath seized in her throat. What was happening? The passenger door of the sedan opened slowly, and then Nathaniel Colton stepped out. His face was a mask of cold calculation. "Going somewhere, Karen?" he asked smoothly. Karen stared in horror, her body frozen. She had been set up. She never had a chance. Lyra had anticipated everything. Her final attempt at revenge had failed before it even began. The end of Karen Lancaster. Nathaniel motioned to his men. "Take her." Karen flailed as strong hands grabbed her arms, yanking her from the driver's seat. No, wait, please. I wasn't going to do anything," she screamed. Nathaniel tilted his head. "Really? Then why were you following my daughter?" Karen's words caught in her throat. I just wanted to talk." Nathaniel laughed softly, but there was no humor in it. "You still don't understand, do you?" he murmured. Karen's lip trembled. Nathaniel leaned in close, his voice barely a whisper. Your life is over. Tears spilled down Karen's face. Please, she sobbed. I'll do anything. Just let me go. Nathaniel's expression didn't change. He straightened. Take her away, he said flatly. Karen screamed as they dragged her back toward the sedan. Lyra watched from the SUV, her face calm, unreadable. As the doors slammed shut, sealing Karen's fate, Lyra turned to her father. Where are you taking her? Nathaniel smirked. Somewhere she can't hurt anyone ever again. Lyra didn't ask further. Karen Lancaster's story had ended, and Lyra Colton's had just begun. The last thing Karen Lancaster remembered before everything went dark was Nathaniel Colton's cold, merciless stare as he uttered those final words. Take her away. And then, blackness. When she woke up, her wrists ached. The cold steel of handcuffs bit into her skin. Her head throbbed, her body stiff from being in one position for too long. She was in a dark, windowless room, the only source of light coming from a single, flickering overhead bulb. Panic crawled up her throat. She had no idea where she was, or how long she had been here. Then the door creaked open, and Karen's breath caught in her throat. The shadow of the Coltons. Two large men in black suits entered first, the same security personnel who had dragged her from her car. But it was the man who followed them in that made her blood turn to ice. Nathaniel Colton. He entered slowly, deliberately, his presence filling the room like an overwhelming force. Karen tried to straighten herself to muster some semblance of composure, but she was trapped, bound, powerless. Her throat was so dry it hurt to speak. Where am I? She rasped. Nathaniel didn't answer immediately. He simply took his time, walking to a sleek black chair in the corner of the room and lowering himself into it, crossing his legs. Then, finally, his voice came, low, calm, deadly. You should be grateful you're not in a jail cell. Karen flinched, her stomach twisting violently. Jail? That possibility had always lurked in the back of her mind, but now it felt terrifyingly real. I didn't do anything, she stammered. Nathaniel's brows lifted slightly like he was amused by her audacity. Didn't do anything, he echoed. That's an interesting way to describe stalking my daughter. Karen's breath hitched. I wasn't stalking her. Nathaniel leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. Then what were you doing, Karen? He asked softly. Karen felt trapped, suffocated under the weight of his stare. She tried to find the words, but her mind was a tangled mess of fear, regret, and rage. Finally, she blurted, I just wanted to talk to her, to make her understand. She ruined my life. Nathaniel exhaled sharply, a sound that almost resembled a laugh, but far more dangerous. Oh, Karen, he murmured, you ruined your own life. The reality of consequences. Karen shook her head violently, her breathing erratic. No, that's not true. She did this to me. She humiliated me. She destroyed everything. My job, my reputation. Nathaniel's expression remained unreadable. I gave you a job, he said. I helped build a company where people like you could thrive. But instead of upholding the values of our airline, you decided to play God at the boarding gate. You thought your bias was more important than our reputation. Karen shook her head, teeth clenched. I didn't know who she was, she hissed. Nathaniel's gaze darkened. And that's the problem, isn't it? Silence pressed in on the room. Karen's heart pounded so hard she thought it might burst. Nathaniel sighed, shaking his head. You could have left well enough alone, he mused. You could have accepted your consequences and moved on. But instead, you tried to go after my daughter. Karen looked away, breathing heavily. Nathaniel stood, adjusting the cuffs of his suit. Well, I'm done wasting time on you, he said. Karen's head snapped up. What are you going to do to me? Nathaniel didn't answer. Instead, he turned to one of his security men. You know what to do. Karen's blood turned to ice. She began to shake violently. Number, wait, please. She lunged forward, but the men were already moving. Cold hands grabbed her arms, her shoulders, her hair. She screamed, kicking, thrashing, but she was dragged out of the room, deeper into the unknown. Lyra's final move. The next morning, Lyra Colton sat at the head of a long mahogany table, sipping her espresso as she skimmed through the morning reports. The Colton Initiative's launch had been an overwhelming success. Media outlets raved about the movement, praising Lyra as a visionary leader. Her name was on every magazine cover, her image plastered across every major news outlet. Her father entered the room, a calm but satisfied expression on his face. It's done, Nathaniel said simply. The last thing Karen Lancaster remembered before everything went dark was Nathaniel Colton's cold, merciless stare as he uttered those final words. Take her away. And then, blackness. When she woke up, her wrists ached. The cold steel of handcuffs bit into her skin. Her head throbbed, her body stiff from being in one position for too long. She was in a dark, windowless room, the only source of light coming from a single, flickering overhead bulb. Panic crawled up her throat. She had no idea where she was, or how long she had been here. Then the door creaked open, and Karen's breath caught in her throat. The shadow of the Coltons. Two large men in black suits entered first, the same security personnel who had dragged her from her car. But it was the man who followed them in that made her blood turn to ice. Nathaniel Colton. He entered slowly, deliberately, his presence filling the room like an overwhelming force. Karen tried to straighten herself to muster some semblance of composure, but she was trapped, bound, powerless. Her throat was so dry it hurt to speak. Where am I? She rasped. Nathaniel didn't answer immediately. He simply took his time, walking to a sleek black chair in the corner of the room and lowering himself into it, crossing his legs. Then, finally, his voice came, low, calm, deadly. You should be grateful you're not in a jail cell. Karen flinched, her stomach twisting violently. Jail? That possibility had always lurked in the back of her mind, but now it felt terrifyingly real. I didn't do anything, she stammered. Nathaniel's brows lifted slightly like he was amused by her audacity. Didn't do anything, he echoed. That's an interesting way to describe stalking my daughter. Karen's breath hitched. I wasn't stalking her. Nathaniel leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. Then what were you doing, Karen? He asked softly. Karen felt trapped, suffocated under the weight of his stare. She tried to find the words, but her mind was a tangled mess of fear, regret, and rage. Finally, she blurted, I just wanted to talk to her, to make her understand. She ruined my life. Nathaniel exhaled sharply, a sound that almost resembled a laugh, but far more dangerous. Oh, Karen, he murmured, you ruined your own life. The reality of consequences. Karen shook her head violently, her breathing erratic. No, that's not true. She did this to me. She humiliated me. She destroyed everything. My job, my reputation. Nathaniel's expression remained unreadable. I gave you a job, he said. I helped build a company where people like you could thrive. But instead of upholding the values of our airline, you decided to play God at the boarding gate. You thought your bias was more important than our reputation. Karen shook her head, teeth clenched. I didn't know who she was, she hissed. Nathaniel's gaze darkened. And that's the problem, isn't it? Silence pressed in on the room. Karen's heart pounded so hard she thought it might burst. Nathaniel sighed, shaking his head. You could have left well enough alone, he mused. You could have accepted your consequences and moved on. But instead, you tried to go after my daughter. Karen looked away, breathing heavily. Nathaniel stood, adjusting the cuffs of his suit. Well, I'm done wasting time on you, he said. Karen's head snapped up. What are you going to do to me? Nathaniel didn't answer. Instead, he turned to one of his security men. You know what to do. Karen's blood turned to ice. She began to shake violently. Number, wait, please. She lunged forward, but the men were already moving. Cold hands grabbed her arms, her shoulders, her hair. She screamed, kicking, thrashing, but she was dragged out of the room, deeper into the unknown. Lyra's final move. The next morning, Lyra Colton sat at the head of a long mahogany table, sipping her espresso as she skimmed through the morning reports. The Colton Initiative's launch had been an overwhelming success. Media outlets raved about the movement, praising Lyra as a visionary leader. Her name was on every magazine cover, her image plastered across every major news outlet. Her father entered the room, a calm but satisfied expression on his face. It's done, Nathaniel said simply. Karen had sealed her own fate. Lyra had just ensured that she could never hurt anyone again. She leaned back in her chair, a small smile forming on her lips. The world had tried to break her. Instead, she had reshaped it. And this was only the beginning. Epilogue. A new era. Begins. 6 months later, the Colton Initiative had expanded globally. Other airlines adopted similar programs, reshaping how bias and discrimination were handled in customer service. Lyra Colton's name became synonymous with change. She was no longer just an heiress. She was a leader, a symbol, a force to be reckoned with. And Karen Lancaster? She was nothing more than a footnote in history, a lesson in what happens when arrogance meets its reckoning. Lyra stood on a balcony overlooking the city, watching the world she had shaped unfold beneath her. She had turned humiliation into power, defeat into dominance. And now, she was unstoppable. The world moved on without Karen Lancaster. For months, the headlines had been brutal. She had been stripped of her career, abandoned by her peers, erased from the industry she once ruled. The woman who once held power over others with a mere glance now found herself powerless. Karen had lost everything, but she was still alive. And that meant there was still a chance, no matter how small, no matter how desperate, to crawl out of the abyss. The underground. Karen had become a phantom, a cautionary tale whispered about in corporate circles. She had moved from city to city, staying in cheap motels, barely scraping by, taking under-the-table jobs that paid just enough to keep her afloat. Every door had been slammed in her face. Every application had been rejected before she even got an interview. Her name was blacklisted. No airline, no hotel, no travel company would ever hire her again. She had gone from commanding first-class passengers to cleaning the floors of rundown diners for cash. And the worst part? The world had forgotten her. No one spoke her name anymore. The Colton Initiative had overshadowed her downfall, turning her from a viral disgrace into nothing but an afterthought. Karen had spent her whole life believing she mattered, and now she was invisible. A desperate plan. For months, Karen had told herself this was temporary, that she would find a way back, that someone, some company, some rich executive, some powerful person, would take pity on her and give her another chance. But now, sitting in a filthy, roach-infested motel room, staring at the last $17 in her bank account, she finally understood the truth. No one was coming to save her. If she wanted to survive, if she wanted to reclaim any part of her life, she would have to force the world to acknowledge her again. And there was only one way to do that. She had to destroy Lyra Colton. The first move. Karen spent weeks researching, planning, hunting for anything that could be used against Lyra. She scoured message boards, social media, corporate filings, old news reports, anything that could give her leverage. And finally, she found something. Something small. Something insignificant, at least on the surface. But Karen had learned one valuable lesson from her own downfall. The internet never forgets. And if she played her cards right, neither would the world. The scandal no one saw coming. The first post appeared on an anonymous forum. A single thread, buried among conspiracy theories and tabloid gossip. But within hours, it began to spread. Within a day, it was trending. And within a week, it was everywhere. Lyra Colton. Hiding family secrets, exposed documents suggest massive cover-up. Is the Colton initiative built on lies? Shocking claims against billionaire heiress. Truth or smear campaign? Karen watched from the darkness, a satisfied smirk creeping onto her lips. She had lit the match. Now she just had to watch the fire spread. Lyra's empire. Under siege. Lyra had been untouchable for months. She had built a movement, a legacy, a new era of corporate responsibility. But now the world was questioning her. Journalists hounded her office, demanding answers. Corporate sponsors hesitated, unwilling to be associated with potential controversy. And for the first time since she had crushed Karen Lancaster, Lyra found herself on the defensive. She sat in her office, staring at the headlines, her jaw tight with frustration. Nathaniel stood beside her, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. "This is a coordinated attack," he said. Lyra exhaled sharply, forcing herself to remain calm. "I know," she murmured. Nathaniel's gaze hardened. "It's Karen." Lyra knew it too. There was no other explanation. Karen Lancaster was a ghost, but one that refused to stay buried. Lyra leaned forward, her fingers tapping against the sleek surface of her desk. "She wants to play games," she said, voice soft but deadly. Nathaniel's lips curled into a smirk. "Then let's end the game." The counterattack Lyra Colton didn't just fight back. She obliterated. She tracked the source of the leaks, traced the digital breadcrumbs back to Karen, and within 48 hours, she had flipped the script. The next morning, the news cycle exploded again. But this time, it wasn't about Lyra. It was about Karen, the death of Karen Lancaster. The headline hit like a nuclear bomb. Disgraced former flight attendant behind smear campaign against Lyra Colton exposed. Within minutes, Karen's name was trending again. But this time, it wasn't as a victim. It was as a fraud, a liar, a desperate woman trying to claw her way back into relevance. Screenshots of her anonymous posts were leaked. IP addresses traced back to her. Bank statements showing Karen had been paid by shadowy third parties to spread false claims. The world saw her for what she was, a woman who had lost everything, except her thirst for revenge. And now she had lost even that. The final nail in the coffin. Karen watched in horror as the news cycle crushed her once again. She had tried to destroy Lyra Colton, and now she was the one being erased. Again. Only this time there would be no third chance. She had burned every bridge, every last thread of her past life had been cut. There was no coming back from this. Karen Lancaster was done. Lyra's victory. As the world turned against Karen for the final time, Lyra sat in her penthouse suite, watching the chaos unfold. Her father poured 2 glasses of whiskey, sliding one to her. "To closure," Nathaniel said, raising his glass. Lyra smirked, clinking hers against his. To power. She had won. Again. And this time, there would be no challengers left. Karen Lancaster had faded into irrelevance. And Lyra Colton, she was just getting started. Karen watched her own obituary unfold in real time. Every screen, every news channel, every digital space she once took for granted was now flooded with her final disgrace. She had tried to take Lyra Colton down, and instead she had dug her own grave. There was no way out this time. no chance at redemption, no thread of hope to cling to. She was officially and completely ruined. And yet she wasn't dead. Not yet. Nowhere left to run. Karen stumbled through the streets, her clothes wrinkled, her hair unkempt, her mind a swirling storm of rage, despair, and confusion. She had been living on the edge of society for months, barely scraping by, hiding in shadows and cheap motels. But now, even that was gone. Her landlord threw her out the moment the latest scandal hit. Her bank account was frozen, hacked, leaked, and emptied by the very media frenzy she had tried to start. She had nothing. No home, no job, no name. The world had swallowed her whole, and worst of all, no one cared. The last enemy. As she wandered the neon-lit streets, Karen realized she had one final enemy left to face. Herself. Her own arrogance had led her here. Her own decisions had destroyed her. She had thought she was powerful. She had thought she was untouchable. But the truth was, she had always been disposable. Lyra Colton had been the real power all along. And Karen? Karen was just another footnote in someone else's victory. Her hands curled into fists, her nails digging into her own skin. Was this it? Was this how her story ended? With nothing? With no one left to listen? Meanwhile, Lyra's empire expands across the city. Lyra Colton sat in her penthouse, the glow of the city skyline reflecting in her wine glass. She had won. Again. The Colton initiative had skyrocketed. Her reputation had cemented itself into legend. And Karen Lancaster? She was less than dust. Her father entered the room, hands in his pockets, a knowing smirk on his face. Karen's finally out of moves, Nathaniel said. Lyra took a sip of her wine. She was out of moves the moment she touched my ticket, she said smoothly. Nathaniel chuckled, taking a seat across from her. So what now? He asked. Lyra leaned back, eyes sharp with calculated amusement. Now? She echoed. She tilted her glass. Now we watch the final act. Karen's last chance. Karen didn't know how long she had been walking. Hours? Days? It didn't matter. She had reached the end of the road. There was only one place left to go. One person left to see. She clenched her jaw, her footsteps echoing loudly against the polished floors of the towering corporate skyscraper. The Colton headquarters. The guards at the front tensed the moment they saw her, as if they had been expecting this moment. Karen's voice was hoarse, broken. I need to see her, she said. The guards glanced at each other, then muttered into their earpieces. Within minutes, a familiar figure appeared. Nathaniel Colton. Karen felt her stomach clench. This man had watched her fall. Now he stood before her like a king facing a peasant. Nathaniel tilted his head. Well, he said, look who finally came crawling. Karen swallowed hard, her pride bleeding away. I need to talk to Lyra, she said. Nathaniel's expression remained unreadable. Why? He asked. So you can try to ruin her again? You've already failed twice, Karen. Do you really want to make it 3? Karen's throat tightened. Please, she whispered. Just let me speak to her. Nathaniel studied her for a long moment. Then, finally, he nodded. Fine, he said. One last conversation. He gestured for the guards to take her inside. Karen followed, her heart pounding. This was it, her last shot, her final battle, and she had nothing left to lose. The showdown. Lyra versus Karen. The office was as cold and pristine as Karen remembered it. But this time, she wasn't the one with power. Lyra sat behind her massive glass desk, looking completely at ease, completely in control. Her expression was not one of anger nor hatred, it was boredom, like she was already done with this conversation before it had even begun. Karen took a shaky breath. Lyra, she started, Lyra held up a hand. Stop, she said. Karen froze. Lyra tilted her head, eyes sharp as a blade. Tell me, Karen, she mused. What exactly do you think this conversation is going to accomplish? Karen's mouth went dry. Lyra leaned forward, fingers steepled. You tried to ruin me. Twice. Her voice was calm, almost amused. And you failed. Twice. Karen's fists clenched at her sides. Did you think I'd feel sorry for you? Lyra interrupted, her smile sharp and dangerous. Karen stared at her, tears threatening to spill. I just want my life back, she whispered. Lyra let out a soft, cruel laugh. You don't have a life anymore, Karen, she said. Karen flinched. Lyra's voice dropped to a whisper. You killed it with your own hands. The words stabbed like knives. Karen felt the weight of her mistakes crushing her. There was no fixing this. No escaping. This was the end. Lyra stood walking to the massive floor-to-ceiling window overlooking the city. You have nothing left, Karen, she murmured. She turned, her eyes glowing with cold finality. And I'm not going to give you anything. Karen couldn't breathe. She had lost, completely, finally, forever. Lyra gave a mocking smile, tilting her head. Now, she said softly, get out of my office. Karen didn't move. Lyra's voice sharpened. You're done here. You're done everywhere. The guards moved toward her. Karen staggered back, shaking her head. Please, she whispered. But Lyra had already turned away, as if she was nothing, as if she never existed at all. The final scene. Karen was dragged out of the Colton building for the last time. This time, there were no cameras. No viral moments, no one cared. She was just another nobody, another failure in the grand scheme of things. As she stood outside, staring up at the towering skyscraper, she realized this was it. Her story was over. And Lyra? Lyra was just getting started. The world moved on. The Colton Initiative had become a permanent force in the airline industry. Corporate policies changed forever. Airlines across the world adopted anti-discrimination measures, and Lyra Colton was hailed as a pioneer of a new era. But Karen Lancaster? Karen had been erased, and that was the cruelest fate of all. The forgotten one. Karen drifted through life like a ghost. No job, no home, no one who would even look her in the eye. Her name had become a stain, a warning to others, a lesson in what happens when you choose the wrong side of history. At first, she tried to fight back. She sent emails, letters, job applications, anything to claw her way back into society, but every response was the same. We regret to inform you that we cannot move forward with your application at this time. Or worse, no response at all. People didn't just reject her, they pretended she didn't exist. And soon, she didn't. The underground whisper months passed. Karen fell off the map completely. She lived in cheap, filthy motels doing small, under-the-table jobs, just to afford food. She avoided public places, fearing that someone would recognize her. She heard the whispers whenever she walked past strangers. People still remembered, but not in the way she wanted. She was notorious. A walking relic of racial arrogance. And the world had no use for her anymore. A chance encounter. One evening, as Karen sat in a dimly lit diner eating her first real meal in days, she overheard a conversation at a nearby booth. Did you hear about that flight attendant? The one who tried to ruin Lyra Colton? Karen froze. She kept her head down, pretending to stir her coffee. A woman laughed. Oh, yeah, what was her name? Karen something? She thought she was so powerful, and now? A man chuckled. She's nothing. Karen's stomach twisted. They were talking about her like she was dead, like she was a joke, like she had never mattered at all. She clenched her fists, her breathing shaky. She wanted to scream, to tell them she was still here, that she still existed, that she was still someone. But even if she did, would it even matter? The last door closes. Karen left the diner, stepping out into the cold night air. The streets were empty, just like her life. She had nowhere to go, no one waiting for her. She leaned against the side of a building, staring up at the towering skyline of the city she had once ruled. She had power once. She had control. She had been someone. And now? Now she was less than nothing. She reached into her pocket, pulling out a crumpled, faded newspaper clipping. It was the last thing she had kept from her old life. A picture of herself in uniform, standing at the airline gate, looking confident, powerful, untouchable. She had believed that she belonged to something bigger than herself. She had believed that her status, her job, her authority made her important. But in the end, none of it had mattered. Because when she had been given a choice between doing the right thing and holding on to her arrogance, she had chosen poorly. And now she would never be forgiven. The final reckoning. Far above the city, in a private executive suite, Lyra Colton sat at her desk, reviewing the latest reports. Her empire was stronger than ever. The Colton Initiative had grown into an international force for corporate accountability. Her name was synonymous with change. Her father entered the room holding a small black folder. "Thought you might want to see this," Nathaniel said, dropping it onto her desk. Lyra raised an eyebrow, flipping it open. Inside was a single report, a list of known locations where Karen Lancaster had been sighted. Her father took a sip of his drink, watching her. "She's still alive," he said simply. Lyra studied the file. Karen had been reduced to nothing, a woman wandering the edges of society, scraping by in the shadows. She was no longer a threat, no longer worthy of concern. Lyra closed the folder, pushing it aside. "She's done," she said, her voice cool. Nathaniel smirked. "Good. Then it's over." Lyra took a deep breath, staring out at the city. It wasn't just over. It had never been a fight to begin with. Karen had never stood a chance. And now she was just a whisper in the wind. A ghost in a world that no longer saw her. And that was the greatest punishment of all. Lessons from the fall of Karen Lancaster and the rise of Lyra Colton. Understanding compassion and the power of justice. The downfall of Karen Lancaster and the rise of Lyra Colton is more than just a story of vengeance and justice. It is a profound reflection of the deep-seated issues of racism, arrogance, and human nature. This narrative forces us to examine not only the cruelty of prejudice, but also the resilience of those who fight against it. It showcases the power dynamics of race and privilege, the consequences of discrimination, and the necessity for change in society. Through these events, we learn valuable lessons about integrity, humility, the importance of self-awareness, and the need to dismantle systemic bias. One of the most striking aspects of Karen Lancaster's failure was not just her immediate dismissal, but the way her actions exposed a much larger issue within the airline industry and society as a whole. Her attitude at the boarding gate, her automatic dismissal of Lyra Colton's legitimacy, and her outright refusal to reconsider her actions speak volumes about the unchecked power of discrimination. Karen's downfall serves as a warning to those who continue to hold subconscious or overt biases, believing that their privilege will always protect them from accountability. At the heart of this story is racism, particularly the kind that manifests in everyday interactions. Karen did not openly use slurs, nor did she physically harm Lyra. Instead, she weaponized her authority, using her power to humiliate and belittle someone simply because of their race. This is an example of systemic racism, the kind that is ingrained in institutions and normalized in professional settings. It is a reality that many Black people and other people of color face daily, being treated with suspicion, disrespect, or outright contempt simply because of their skin color. Lyra Colton's experience at the airport was a painfully common one. Many Black travelers have encountered situations where they are questioned, doubted, or treated as if they don't belong, whether in first-class lounges, luxury stores, or high-end hotels. It is the silent message of exclusion that tells people of color, "You don't deserve this space." Karen's actions were a manifestation of that mindset, a moment where she acted on the belief that a young black girl in first class was out of place. This kind of racism is insidious because it often comes with a veneer of professionalism. Karen likely did not believe she was being racist. She justified her actions as protecting the integrity of her job, convinced that she was simply following protocol. But in truth, her behavior was fueled by her own deep-seated prejudices. She didn't question the legitimacy of white passengers in first class, only Lyra. This highlights a crucial lesson. Racism isn't always overt, but it is always harmful. Karen's ultimate failure was her refusal to take responsibility for her actions. Even when confronted with the truth, she refused to acknowledge her own bias. Instead, she chose to double down on her arrogance, convincing herself that she was the victim. This is a common reaction when privileged individuals are called out for their discrimination. Rather than reflecting, they seek to defend their actions, justify their behavior, or even retaliate against those who expose them. But the world is changing, and Karen learned that the hard way. Accountability is no longer optional. Lyra's response to injustice, however, demonstrates the power of resilience and strategic action. Rather than simply seeking personal revenge, she channeled her pain into meaningful change. The Colton Initiative became a beacon of reform, not just addressing Karen's actions, but transforming the industry itself. This is perhaps the most valuable lesson. True justice is not just about punishing the guilty, it's about preventing the same injustices from happening to others. Lyra's ability to turn her personal humiliation into an opportunity for societal change speaks to the beauty of human nature. The ability to rise above adversity and make the world better for others. It showcases leadership, wisdom, and the kind of legacy that transcends personal experiences. In contrast, Karen's descent into obscurity illustrates what happens when people refuse to evolve, when they cling to their outdated beliefs even as the world moves forward without them. Beyond the themes of justice and accountability, this story also highlights the importance of culture and diversity. The airline industry, like many global businesses, thrives on inclusion. People from different backgrounds, ethnicities, and races travel the world every day. To deny someone their dignity based on their appearance is to undermine the very essence of global progress. The Colton Initiative wasn't just about punishing discrimination. It was about celebrating diversity and making the industry more equitable for all. There is also an underlying lesson about power. Karen believed she had power, but in reality her power was an illusion, one that crumbled the moment she was held accountable. True power, as demonstrated by Lyra, comes not from title or authority, but from the ability to inspire change. Lyra understood that real influence is about shaping the world for the better, not about controlling others out of arrogance or bias. This story also reflects on the concept of redemption. Karen had multiple opportunities to apologize, to reflect, to grow, but she chose pride over redemption. By the time she realized the gravity of her mistakes, it was too late. This teaches us an important lesson. When we are confronted with our own wrongdoings, we must be willing to acknowledge, learn, and change. Otherwise, we risk falling into a spiral of resentment and self-destruction. Another valuable takeaway is the importance of allyship and standing against discrimination. Many people in the story witnessed Karen's actions but hesitated to intervene. This reflects a common reality. Many bystanders are afraid to speak up against racism and injustice. However, true progress requires active participation. It is not enough to be non-racist. One must be anti-racist, willing to challenge and call out injustice when it happens. In conclusion, the rise of Lyra Colton and the fall of Karen Lancaster reveal the ugly truth about racial bias, but they also illuminate the beauty of justice, resilience, and social progress. It reminds us that discrimination has no place in a world that values equality and human dignity. It teaches us that those who misuse power will eventually fall, and those who stand for truth and justice will rise above oppression. The most important lesson? Racism, arrogance, and prejudice are no longer tolerated in a society that demands accountability. The world is watching, and those who fail to evolve will be left behind.